And good morning, everybody. David Cross back again. This time I'm bringing up a new video about Node-RED. If you haven't heard of Node-RED, would definitely recommend you look into it. Take a look on Google and find some links, videos, etc. It's a great utility that was designed by IBM, underwritten by them, and that allows for node manipulation, which represent tasks, functions, data, to be dragged onto a canvas and to be wired together to perform effectively multitask functions or workflows, and basically what they call flows. So what I wanted to introduce today not only was just kind of some overview of Node-RED, just real quick overview, because there's so much you're going to have to kind of pick up over time, but to introduce how Node-RED, using my Unix version of this, kind of building out a custom workflow and extending on top of the IP address management capabilities and how we work with the APIs. And so I have effectively two APIs that I've kind of constructed my own, which are multifunction processes. And I wanted to go over each. One is the ability to create new subnets, mimicking the finding of VLAN in a state and creating the next available subnet, returning the results back to the user, and also to allow for individual IP addresses to be assigned and in quantities, doing that same type of lookup, wherein clients may not know a subnet, but they may know the VLAN ID, they may know the state data center, and they may know the quantity. And so here, that concept is, don't give us the subnet ID or IP, we'll do the lookup for you. But then I further break this down into some of the capabilities of IPControl's APIs to extract out utilization details, pull out subnets that qualify, and to compare the results to ensure that the selection of the subnet matches some criteria based on utilization. So I think I'll have to do two videos. The IP address one and the utilization gets a little bit further into this, but I'm going to see how long this takes me, and we'll go ahead and start here. So again, Node-RED is a canvas, effectively, that you drag these nodes onto that allow you to perform functions. And so there are base nodes that provide both input and output as defined in their categories. And within those other categories, there might be things like creating JavaScript functions, because this whole premise of Node-RED is built on Node.js, and Node.js is JavaScript backend server side. And this is actually allowing us to build those APIs using endpoints. So there's some functions that we can implement, as well as the ability to send HTTP requests and interacting with external web APIs like I am doing here. And also to note that in the cloud automation appliance from BT in Diamond IP is going to have pre-built nodes wrapped around these APIs, which I'm just kind of doing from scratch. So you're kind of seeing how that process is, but theirs is professionally developed, wrapped around their solutions and tied into what they're doing. And so they modified that to their abilities in their cloud automation appliance. So it's a good thing there. But also having the ability to do things like TCP and UDP, packets directly, splitting out data. So if you're receiving JSON or XML, CSV, you can instruct the Node-RED to split all that data for you, processing each of the individual rows to do something with the functions. And you can either split it out and join it back together again to present results, or do other types of processing with it. And it just goes on. And these nodes get very extensive. They cover things like Google APIs. They even get down into IBM's Watson and doing some other type of communication like Telegram, chatbots, which maybe in one of these future videos we'll get to. Right? So I'm not going to go into too much of this again, but I just want to talk on these flows here. So what I built in using these flows in Node-RED and dragging them on the canvas is I have effectively built a new API endpoint by dragging a request node onto the canvas and telling it that I want this to be a get method. So in my example, I want to be able to do this through the URL get parameters. And so far I can. And I can do other types of methods here as well, which some of the APIs we get into will. Now, in terms of input, this is assuming that this is the endpoint, which is the beginning of the process. And therefore, the left of the side is input, where we'll call the API, but the right is output. So the construct of all of these nodes, and they all have documentation, tells you that they're going to output in a message what they call a payload, which will be a JSON structure that the next node in the process takes, uses for its purposes, extracts values or copies values, and then passes on to the next process and next process. And you control that payload all the way from the beginning of the request to the end of the request, which is all the way down here in this bottom part, catching all of the errors here. And what we need to do as well is pass that back into a endpoint that tells it it's done. Okay, so there's a couple things here that we're doing. So we take the input request, and the input request we're expecting, and you'll look up here in our comments, that we're going to call the new subnet with a question mark, and then we're going to pass it in at least two variables to tell it that we want to have a VLAN ID equal to a value, and that we want the state, which we're going to identify by user-defined field. In this case, might be London, but it might be Georgia, where I'm at, or somewhere else. And in the user-defined fields that we're going to use for this purpose is we're looking for that information, VLAN ID, and something that has those fields, so that we can determine what container is this new subnet going to be allocated in, so that we can go out and call the next import method. So we're using these as lookup values to determine overall that we're going to be landing this in ATLVO 0928 container. And once we know that, we then are able to construct the import, which will then be passed on and through the process. So further from there, once we get this input data, Node-RED allows you to modify certain nodes and act as a function where you can manipulate the underlying parameters or flow sets or the messages that are being passed in between all of the different values. So what I have here is I'm basically pulling out the message VLAN ID in the state, and then I'm copying those into a global flow variable list that's going to be available to any of the nodes within this tab. And I'm going to use that later on because I need to call these back into the functions as we move down the payloads. And then logging this out in terms of that. And then further, what we're going to do then with that information is we're going to start preparing an API call into the REST APIs of IPControl. So this is where we're going to get into some of the JavaScript functions. So if you're a programmer, you can do all of this down into this particular level and manage it at this point. If you're not into programming, there are ways to do this through all of the nodes that are provided using the functions like switch and change, and more specifically change, which allows you then to copy variables between different things like the payload into a new variable or into an expression or even into a JSON string, which then you can construct moving forward. Right. So again, I happen to get into the developing side to understand the low end of this. And so this is what this is demonstrating here. But this will show how you would construct that JSON to pipe it into a payload, which is then going to call into a REST API specifically. Now, what we're doing in here is I'm going ahead and getting a global token, which will be used for my authentication. I have already a node that is obtaining this login, which you can kind of see grayed back here, that is doing it on a timestamp. So I'm kind of making this as a generally available web service to end users that can call it, right? But I could constrict this as well. I'm then telling it that the payload that's being passed in, which we said in the previous node, is the VLAN ID, and that's what we're going to extract. The state we're pulling from the flow variable, so we do a flow.get, pulling in the name of the state as the key, and then we're going to construct the message headers that we need to build for the bearer, authorization bearer, and the accept and content type for application JSON. Now, I have also the ability through this API just to specify, find me the first match of the VLAN ID and where it's enabled, so that it'll just pick the first one available. But I also wanted to break this down to states. So I'm putting in a check, just for my purposes, that I'm checking that if the state's there, I want to construct a query that then includes the state UDF in combination with the API enabled and also the VLAN ID to extract a list of subnets that will be candidates for this new subnet to clone or to pull out the container name. And if it does not have a state, just do this very simply, find the first VLAN ID and where it's enabled. Page size 1 doesn't matter, but we're going to call the initialization export to get this data, and it's going to return all the results in one call. All right. And the last part of this is because I'm constructing a new payload, you don't have to, but I did. I'm constructing a new one and passing it forward. You then tell it that the message payload output will be this new payload variable. Okay. And then our HTTP request then allows us effectively to go out and call the APIs. And we're going to tell it the URL and other details here that we're going to call. And then our HTTP request is where we're going to establish what type of connection we're going to make back to the IPControl executive. Or again, if we're calling this through the cloud automation appliance, you would have your own built-in nodes for this, but it would use a local reference for that. Now, Node-RED also enables Ssl connections, and so you can set up and define your TLS. However, I'm telling it not to verify it. I just want to ignore the certificate here, but you do have very capable ways of managing certificates for that authorization and authentication there. And then what I want to return on this, and Node gives you options, but I want to return parsed object. So I want a JSON parsed, but I could just return a string or a binary buffer that I would expand, and again, a name that we're going to reference this by. And then what we want with the output of this is we're going to send it to a check results. And effectively what the check results will look for is the message payload. If it's null, we'll send it out to the first output. So this represents outputs in the message flow. Otherwise, it's good, and we're going to go out to the second flow. And when you highlight these, it'll tell you if it's null, if that's the selection, or otherwise here. Now, if it is a null, it's sending it out to this connection here. And as a matter of fact, let's go ahead and send our error message out to the same. Now, if it is, there are details. Let's say that there's something in the payload, then we want to process that information. And so what we now have is another function, which again, I've broken out the functions so I can understand the underlying results, that you're, again, constructing a message header because we're going to call another API. So we're going to pull out the details of the first one. We're going to construct the same message header, and then we're going to get the results of the first result set. We then want to go through and get the containers that are going to be passed back in that result. That's really all we needed to get. And so we just pull out the result and the child block in the container. We know that's a variable, and we set that message container to that variable. But now, moving forward, we're going to tell it to import a new subnet using that container. So we're also going to construct the new payload, which in this case is going to represent the subnet or child block details for creating these new subnets. Now I have details in here that are specific to my environment, like DNS servers, primary DHCP, and these are things hard-coded to my set. So you want to make sure you verify your user-defined fields and things you're calling. Make sure they match to your environment. But take a look at that, but this is how it's structured. And so this is a block structure to import, which we're going to use moving forward. Now, the key to this is, and I believe here, that we do not have an IP address in this, and that's what is effectively telling our API we don't. Okay, so that's what I wanted to point out here. So in this payload, because we're going to use an API function of IPControl, we're just going to give us the next available subnet. So we're not including what subnet address we're going to create. We're going to just tell it now in the container, we're going to create a block of this type, which is the block type data, and it's going to give us that next available. Now, I also want to put a limit on this. I want to put a throttler, rate limiter. So I only want so many messages to go through, and in processing, so I can control this and make sure that I'm not overwhelming the servers. So I'm doing one message per 3 seconds. I'm letting everything through, but you could drop this if you were so inclined. And then we're passing our function and JavaScript payload we just built back into this post again, which is going to tell us that we're going to go out and call an API endpoint, passing it as a post, the import child block. And it is then going to create a subnet for us, which again, I'm going to take the payload of it, parse it out, and pull out the IP addresses of the result that was assigned back to us. And then I'm going to call another API, kind of chaining this forward, that is then going to get more of the block details. Because the result back from that add is that only the subnet address. I now want it to pull back all of the block detail. So I'm going to do the get block by IP address call, passing forth that IP address with a status of deployed from there. And so from that, I should expect that the results are going to be formatted. I'm going to go ahead and pull out the payload, and I'm going to create a string simply that adds those values to the string, adding a carriage return at the end using JavaScript notations here for everything. I then set my global values, and I'm going to increment, the subnet, the sets, and VLAN ID and the state. And then I'm lastly doing two things here. I'm doing a page construct that's basically creating a template using the use mustache template if you're interested in the JSON and Node.js. But it gives you the HTML template that we can then say within the body of this, we're just going to include the block results, which is that string that's being passed. And also, I want to tell it to go out, and I've constructed an email chain, which is sending it out to my contact IP DevNet. I won't go through all the details there. You probably saw. But from there, I'm then going to pass all of this information back to an endpoint, which matches the input, which is going to then return back our response. Now, because I changed something here, I'm going to go ahead and deploy it. So anything you deploy in Node, you actually just click on the deployed, and you can select the full nodes, the modified, or just the selected, and it gives you that control. Right? So then what I really want to do now is I want to go ahead and grab this string because I want to almost duplicate this exactly and call our new API that we have. And instead of London, I want to put GA, Georgia. And instead of 301, I know I have 1111, which we've used in others that I know is available. Now this is also running HTTPS, so I need to make sure I'm setting the HTTP protocol correctly. Now this, of course, will give me the issue with the certificate there, but kind of moving forward, what I expect is going to happen and has done, it's just throwing out the output telling me that it's assigned a new subnet to me, and this is the subnet. It gave me a block name, which is the default, and here's the size. And so I should have expect also that somewhere down the line, I'm going to get an email that's going to effectively show me those same results. And so that was a real quick, I think, demo. Actually, not too quick, 17 minutes. But we could go into more of this in detail, and I think we'll need to, over time, to explain really all of its capabilities and to narrow down the focus into certain areas. But I want to show this as what's capable as a simple API, and only for reference, and only because I'm somewhat familiar with this, that the APIs took a night, an evening, maybe 4 or 5 hours over the evening to kind of construct this out for the presentation we were doing, both of these. And so when we talk about rapid deployment of APIs and prototyping of this, it is just phenomenal what it's capable of doing. And I suggest if you're not doing it already, just go ahead and install it, take a look at it, and move from there. So in my next video, I'm going to jump into the IP addresses, and we're going to talk about how we're utilizing some of the new APIs for the blocks that have utilization extraction, so that we can make a determination of what subnet best fits the match for the number of quantity they're requesting, and to make sure that, of course, we can honor that request in our API. So that's the next video on this, so stay tuned, and hopefully it'll get more exciting as we move through it. And hopefully you can see to the value of just kind of dragging these workflows to do this. It may seem like you have a lot of steps here. I am doing a lot of steps. But think too that when we get into things where once you build this API, it's there, and you always maintain it, and it's very simple to update. And of course, the simplicity of this is, again, if I wanted to share this type of information, I could export it to a library or to a clipboard and export out to a file for download, and literally you copy and paste it into your flow, and it recreates this entire workflow, which is, again, I like that word phenomenal to describe things that I really appreciate. So there's some great more things to come. Stay tuned, and thanks for hanging out with me. And have a great day and good weekend if we don't talk again today.